As recently as last night, former President Trump made this same terrifying promise at rallies and events across the country. He's doing that. He has promised to cut funding to schools with vaccine or mask mandates. But think about the practicality of what Donald Trump is threatening here. All 50 states have some form of vaccine mandates on the books, so Trump is essentially saying he'd be prepared to cut federal support from every single public school district in this country. Even in Trump's beloved Florida, where ultra-conservative Ron DeSantis is governor, the health department says all children who attend Florida schools, public or private, are required to be immunized. And why is this? Oh, you know, because vaccines work and have been accepted as a key component to keeping kids and families from getting sick. Joining me now, Vin Gupta, NBC News health policy analyst, and Zerlina Maxwell, host of Mornings with Zerlina on Sirius XM. Two of my favorite people. Thank you both so much for being here. Dr. Gupta, let's start with you. Just to set the record straight, why are vaccines so important?
Well, you led off with it, but measles, let's take, for example, measles and meningococcal meningitis vaccines. These are vaccines that are recommended by the CDC. In the case of measles, it's required, to your point, in school districts across the country. There's no question about it, MMR vaccine for short. Meningitis, on the other hand, for college students, college freshmen, it's recommended in most places, required in some. Why does this matter? We've noticed places like Ohio, Florida, just in 2024, have had significant outbreaks amongst unvaccinated children, which, by the way, Alicia, has resulted in 1 in 3 ending up in the hospital. 15% with meningococcal meningitis who are unvaccinated die. So we're talking about here, what are the thresholds of acceptability for death and significant disability if we don't abide by these common sense, long-held vaccine mandates for routine childhood vaccinations? We're talking about serious disability and serious risk of death.
Zerlina, what we heard from the former president, I am not accustomed to that level of message discipline from the former president. So that tells me that what he is saying is ginning up some portion of his base and actually working. This wasn't always a partisan hot button issue. How did we get here? And why is it continuing to benefit Donald Trump?
Well, we got here because of the global pandemic. And I think that there is a portion of the Republican base at this moment that is very much anti-science and anti-vaccine. And Donald Trump has proven time and again that he will say anything, regardless of the harm to people and the American public, to get an applause. I mean, you played a number of clips there, and right after he said that, there was a loud applause. And so he will say anything to pander to the extreme wing of the base that is anti-vaccine. And this is a really dangerous precedent, not just because of the reasons that Dr. Gupta laid out, but also because people need to trust their leaders to base their decisions on fact and science. And we have to get back to that. I feel like this election is so important, Alicia, because we really need to vote like our lives depend on it. And if we're not basing your decisions on science, then issues like climate change, a future pandemic, those are things that are going to put the American people's lives in danger. And we need serious leadership to address those issues.
So, Dr. Gupta, I think Zerlina really helps us set the stakes there. If this is about life and death, what would it mean if these mandates were lifted? Well,
we're seeing it play out in real time. In Ohio in 2022, what happened in Columbus, 100 children ended up unvaccinated largely, ended up getting exposed to measles. 1 in 3 ended up in the hospital. This is serious business here. This is not abstract. To Zerlina's point, also to the stakes, the CDC and the FDA, under the wrong leadership, if they appointed individuals that were enabling this, they could do some serious damage here. The CDC has the capability. We have great leadership right now. The CDC has the capability to say, you know what, we're going to move everything to optional when it comes to what childhood vaccinations are recommended, required, or optional. They could do that. The FDA could introduce delays when it comes to clearing the next booster shot. I mean, there's ways that they can manipulate the ways in which people receive vaccination guidelines. And I mean, it goes to say 35 states across the country have requirements on meningococcal meningitis vaccine. The other 15, including Arizona, the largest, which is home to the largest public university in the country, Arizona State, recommends something for which it prevents a disease that has a 15% mortality rate. Why are these things even recommended in the first place?
Yeah, well, you answered your own question. I mean, Zerlina, you had Glenn Youngkin winning the governorship of Virginia with a parents' right platform. This seems like an outgrowth of that same energy, which is, as you know, not really about parental rights. What has parental rights become a proxy for?
Well, I think parental rights are effectively this libertarian wing of the right that doesn't want government involved in any decisions. But in a moment where we have just gone through a global pandemic where millions of Americans listened to anti-science rhetoric and lost loved ones or lost their own lives because they did not pay attention to the directives of the CDC, of experts like Dr. Gupta, and get vaccinated, wear masks when we were told to do that. And I think that we need to be very serious in this moment. Donald Trump's rhetoric is not only dangerous because of the impact on our democracy, but also on our safety. And he will say, he has said himself, I don't even care about you. I just want your votes. And so we have to remember, at the end of the day, as much as the political debate is entertainment, Donald Trump is not an entertainer. He once was, but he cannot play act as president. He needs to take it seriously, and I'm certain that this will come up at the debate where we will have the contrast between somebody who is leading the country and somebody who has been involved in a performance of the role as president.
Dr. Gupta, I often talk, to Zerlina's point, about sort of the Trump hangover, the fact that even when he is not in power, there are still reminders everywhere of the effect that he had on public opinion. And these attitudes about vaccines are just one example.
Oh, absolutely. You know, what we saw pre-pandemic to now, to Zerlina's point, to build on that, there's been a 50% increase in the number of parents who think, pre-pandemic to now, that routine childhood vaccinations like measles, mumps, and rubella should be voluntary. Just over the course of the last few years. So the spillover effect is real, and we're seeing this depth of expertise. Dr. Fauci talked about it a few days ago, the unwillingness to buy into expertise. What does that mean? We've created an unsafe environment for people as they navigate their own healthcare journey, that they're going to rely on supplements, things that are not FDA approved because they don't believe in the FDA, whatever it may be. So now we have a bunch of individuals who are willing to take their own healthcare decisions, leveraging the internet or leveraging their favorite podcast host. And that's not where expertise is found. And that challenge of expertise here is posing multiple challenges. But again, we've seen just this over the last 5 years.
As we talk about the decline of expertise, what a treat to have an actual medical doctor with me, Dr. Vin Gupta, my friend, Zerlina Maxwell. So good to see you on my TV. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. If you recall, and I know you do, after the 2020 election, Trump and his campaign, they filed 62 lawsuits claiming the election had been stolen. One of those lawsuits ended with Trump's team winning 3 days for Pennsylvania voters to cure ballots that weren't counted. But the other 61 lawsuits, well, they failed miserably. This newly released recording, Stone isn't just trying to relitigate those failures and claim that the 2020 election was rigged. No, he isn't even just saying that he expects the 2024 election to be, quote unquote, rigged. He is also saying that the Republican effort to take those false claims to court will be much bigger and better run this time around, particularly now that Trump's daughter-in-law, Lara Trump, controls the RNC.
We showed it half a dozen places. And then we found it now on offensive footing. Remember, the Republican National Committee raised $200 million and they didn't spend any of it to try to get cleaner elections. Oh, look at what happened last time. We now finally have control of that mechanism. Don't be discouraged.
So we're going to spend, the RNC is going to spend more money now.
Far more.
When reached for comment by the Rolling Stones, Stone downplayed the statements he made in those recordings, saying that, quote, all of the election integrity provisions he mentioned are perfectly legal. But that's not exactly a denial that these bad faith election challenges are indeed coming. And with a misinformation ecosystem that is primed for exactly this kind of stuff, how do we protect our democracy? During the 2020 election, former Obama White House counsel Bob Bauer helped lead the Biden campaign's response to Trump's barrage of bad faith election lawsuits. This week, Bauer is out with a brand new book that tackles these very issues. It's called The Unraveling: Reflections on Politics Without Ethics and Democracy in Crisis. In it, Bauer examines the line between hard-nosed political combat and a politics devoid of ethics. Quote, Political actors bear responsibility to demonstrate in the choices they make that politics can and should be an honorable and ethical calling. Good politics can be played hard and passionately, but also with respect for the limits beyond which it cannot ethically go. Not all the limits are clear. Not everyone agrees on the limits. However, there has to be agreement that there are limits of some kind, and that political actors are accountable for honestly confronting choices and accepting responsibility for those they make. Joining me now, Bob Bauer, President Biden's personal attorney, former White House counsel in the Obama administration. Again, his new book, The Unraveling Reflections on Politics Without Ethics and Democracy in Crisis. Bob, what a title. Congratulations on the book. Thank you so much for being here. I'm struck by the fact that in the book you describe yourself as having a warrior mentality, but you also question whether winning at all costs is worth it. I wonder how you walk the fine line between those poles when you know that the other side, they're not afraid to go low.
Not a partisan issue. It's a bipartisan question of what kind of politics we're going to have in this country, whether it's going to be a true small d democratic politics or it's going to be a politics which I call an anti-politics that treats an adversary as an adversary not to be defeated, but an enemy to be destroyed, that treats the law as something to be basically shunted to one side or misused to hound or harass political opponents. Or, as you pointed out in your opening, where there's absolutely no limit on the lies that are peddled to voters, no responsibility on the part of those who write the ads or cover the ads to really police them for some measure of honesty and fairness to the voters. And a politics without ethics is not a democratic politics. Now, to the question that you asked, I want to stress this. I reject the premise that, and I think I and others in Democratic campaigns have done this for quite some time, I reject the premise that you can't compete hard, that you can't be strong in your convictions, you can't be vigorous in your campaigns, and at the same time run them ethically and win. You can win. I was with the Obama campaign in 2008. The president won. President Obama won. I was with the re-election campaign of President Obama in 2012. He won. President Biden in 2020. He won. So victory is possible, but the overall effect, corrosive effect of a politics without ethics, irresponsible behavior by those who have those choices to make in government and politics is something we have to be deeply concerned about, and that is an issue for Democrats as well as Republicans.
Bob, understanding that past is prologue, I want to talk a little bit about 2020 and then how it applies to what you're looking for in 2024. So, summer 2020, you outlined a multi-step strategy in the summer in anticipation of Trump questioning the results of the November election. I wonder when you realized you were actually going to need to execute on this plan.
Well, remember that former President Trump made no bones about his belief that he couldn't possibly lose an honest election. Any election he lost would be a rigged election. As a matter of fact, he even claimed that he hadn't lost to Ted Cruz in the Iowa caucuses, so there was something fishy about that election as well. And so he flagged that, as did others in his campaign circle, and a lot of energy and effort went into thinking through what sort of steps they might take to challenge the election, what steps they might take to undermine the process beforehand or to challenge the process after. And I write in my book about how much effort went into identifying any conceivable challenge. By the way, thousands of lawyer hours, thousands of pages of memos. Not all of it came to pass. But having said that, there were threats that we anticipated. They did come to pass. And as you point out in your introduction, Trump and his campaign did not succeed at all.
So, as you just laid out, 2020, Trump is already setting the groundwork for the fact that this was a possibility. He is doing the same thing again this time around, already saying that he'll call into question the results of the 2024 election. It is interesting that you and I are talking tonight because as we come on the air, there's a new Fox News national poll that actually shows President Biden leading Trump 50% to 48% nationally among registered voters, which is notable because I think that's the first time we have seen that in this poll this cycle. Do you believe that Team Biden is prepared for the novel ways, right? The new ways that Team Trump has imagined once again subverting democracy?
Well, I recount in the book how we prepared in 2020, and it was exhaustive. And I can say the preparations are just as exhaustive, if not more so, this time around. And the effort here, I want to be very clear, the effort here is not just to prepare to protect to win, it's to prepare to protect a process. And I will say at the same time that I'm involved in this campaign, and I am very involved in the campaign, I also work with Republicans on initiatives that are meant to be bipartisan to support our election officials in the conduct of elections. That's where the partisan politics has to stop. It has to stop at the point at which we're attacking the process that we all depend upon for the fulfillment of the democratic process, for the fulfillment of democratic, will, yes.
Forgive me, Bob. In as much as you were clear about the fact that this is a bipartisan challenge, you're also clear about the fact that when we talk about Republicans, this is bigger than Donald Trump, right? You fault Republicans in the Senate for what you call an egregious offense against norms when they ignored President Obama's nomination of Merrick Garland to the Supreme Court. You also note that, quote, when another election year vacancy developed upon the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the Senate Republicans decided to rush the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett ahead of voter choice, only months off. The argument Republicans had advanced in 2016 somehow lost its force for them in 2020 when the nomination was theirs to make and the seat was theirs to fill. How corrosive was that specific breach in ethics?
In my view, this is the kind of step taken just to win, to push through a result because you can push through that result, that added together with all the other actions of that kind that are taken really does have a long-term undermining effect, not just on the way the process should operate, but on the public's confidence in the process. The public loses faith that politics is an honorable calling, and that at some point in seeking their favor, seeking their vote in a campaign, there is a limit. There is a limit to what responsible political actors will do. In the same way that they have to hope that in trying to enact public policies, there's a limit to what people in government will do to win a policy debate. There have to be those limits. I'm convinced, by the way, that victory is possible while adhering to those limits. But now the public's confidence that that's true has been shaken.
Bob, you write in The Unraveling about a moment after January 6th where you thought, quote, democratic life will get back to normal. That seems very quaint now. I'm sure you will agree nothing feels normal. We're in the middle of what we keep calling the most consequential election of our lifetime. I just wonder 5 months out what it is that keeps you up at night.
You have to worry about everything. We are living through a period of very polarized politics in which we have seen a lot of ethical compunctions fall away, norms challenged, not just norms challenged, literally repudiated in principle. And I do believe, however, if I can just strike an optimistic note, having traveled around the country and spoken to election officials and community leaders, both Democratic and Republican, that yes, there is a wing of the Republican Party that Donald Trump commands that is prepared to repudiate those norms, prepared to challenge elections, prepared to say that the system is irredeemably corrupt. But there are others, some of them quiet, who think, even if they will vote for Republicans, that we have to defend the democratic process and that there is a form of democratic politics that is ethical and respectful of the voters and respectful of democratic traditions and norms. I've heard that from Republicans. And I believe that there is a large number, whether they're Republicans, Independents, Democrats, more than a majority that wants to stand up and defend the democratic process in the United States. So as much as I worry at night, because you've asked me what I worry about, and it's a fair amount, I have confidence that ultimately, as I had confidence in 2020, that we're going to see the country, the voters, stand up for the process that's currently under such severe attack.
Bob, that optimism that you shared is in high demand and short supply, so thank you for ending us there. President Biden's personal attorney, former White House counsel in the Obama administration, and the author of the brand new book, The Unraveling, Reflections on Politics Without Ethics and Democracy in Crisis. Thank you so much, Bob.